When people think of the afterlife in Celtic religion, they often think of reincarnation. In fact, reincarnation is very well attested in medieval sources. And at least in some of these cases, it is implied that reincarnation takes place along family lines. In other cases, a god is in some way involved in the reincarnation, as we see with Mongan. However, it should be stressed that reincarnation was not the only thing that could happen to one upon death, and was perhaps not even the common thing that would happen. For just as there are people attested to have been reincarnated, there are also many attested undead spirits. So obviously these people were not reincarnated. Furthermore, we have the ancestral house of Dawn, Dawn the ancestor of all the Gaels, who keeps a house for the souls of the dead. This figure, Dawn, is probably equivalent to a figure like Yama. And of course, there's the very well-attested and famous Tir na Nog, the land of eternal youth. And sometimes people like to imagine this place as a kind of pagan heaven, but this doesn't seem to be supported by the text. Rather, it might be more akin to something we see in Greek tradition, which is the Blessed Isle, a place ruled over by Kronos, and where heroes and such would go. And likewise, it was also said to be on the far west of the world. And finally, there might be some inklings towards there being a kind of Norse Valhalla-like afterlife as well. And this seems to be centered around Lugh. There are several sort of cryptic references to this in material around Cuchulainn, where he is said to have been invited by Lugh to his noisy brug. And given the context of the statement, it seems to reference it as a reward for being extremely valorous. And indeed, in the death story of Cuchulainn, he does achieve a kind of immortality by retaining a spirit form after death, which is later seen, where it is said that his chariot rides through the sky. And so we are presented with a wide range of things, of possibilities in the afterlife, not simply one idea of reincarnation. Now, an argument could be made that this is due to later influence, whether Christian or otherwise. But there's reason to believe, based on archaeological evidence, that there was a variety of beliefs as well. For instance, there is a tradition of being buried with grave goods. Now, one would only be buried with grave goods if it had some sort of meaning for the person who died, whether you were sending those goods with them, whether they were to be used as barter to access the underworld, or for whatever other possible use that they could give to one. Julius Caesar commented that in the past, the Gauls had practiced a rite that was very similar to what is attested Germanic peoples or Norse peoples of having done, which is putting to death the wife or the concubine of the man who died. Now, he said at the time of writing that this was no longer really being practiced, but it was something that still existed within memory. This conception would seem to support an idea of an existing afterlife where one goes with their possessions and with their woman to reside, if not forever, then at least for a significant period of time. Now, there are examples of luxurious grave sites in Britain and Ireland. However, it seems to be the most common practice for there to be almost no burial at all. At least this is the case during the Iron Age. Of course, in the early Bronze Age, they were still practicing different rites. And so there is no consistency between locations and between time periods about what kind of burial rites were being practiced. There was a variety of practices. But for the most part, the remains that have been found are not consistent with the population figures, so some archaeologists speculate that excarnation was indeed practiced in a majority of cases. Excarnation is the leaving of the body out on the land or on an elevated spot for animals to consume or to be rotted away by the sun. We see this practice in Zoroastrianism. We also see this in Tibetan Buddhism. However, we also know another fact, which is that the head was considered to be the resting place of the soul, and that the head was held in extreme regard. An archaeological site near London actually recovered hundreds and hundreds of skulls buried around a particular area with no bodies anywhere near them. And this seems to have been not the site of an execution, to my mind, but the site of a holy burial place for the heads. And we see a reflection of this in the story of Bendigeidfran, who has his head buried in a specific spot near London, or in London. Now, this reverence for the head as being the seat of the soul isn't necessarily purely only Celtic. It does seem to have been at least remembered in a sort of way by the Romans, because they venerated the images of the heads of their ancestors. They used to make masks of their dead ancestors and carry them around at special events where they honored the spirits of their ancestors. And so this idea seems to have been shared at some point. We also see this reflected in the way that gods were depicted in native art, which is generally simply as floating heads. This is to represent them as spiritual entities. Unlike some other groups, for instance Germanic peoples, Norse peoples, who seem to have had a very physical understanding of the afterlife, in that the soul was not necessarily separate from the body, Celtic evidence seems to suggest that there was a developed idea of a differentiation between the physical body and the soul. Indeed, it is hard to imagine any process of reincarnation where this wouldn't be the case. But could all of these ideas about the afterlife have really coexisted within the same religion? Well, ancient paganism was not a systematic religion, it was very local based. And so different beliefs existed from village to village in some cases. However, it is very possible for all of these to have coexisted within one set of beliefs. It would likely depend on what kind of life that one led as to what one would expect in the afterlife. And in the Greek tradition, we do have examples of this that are corollary, I think. So we have the Blessed Isles, where heroes go. We also have a divine or semi-divine status, the becoming of a kind of deity, probably akin to saints. And we also have a standard sort of default afterlife, where one's spirit goes into the underworld and lives as a shade. And even within that shady afterlife, where Hermes brings the souls of the dead after death, even there is different statuses that a spirit can obtain there, depending on what one has done in life, whether they have performed certain acts or rituals, such as participated in the cult of Demeter. And of course, later on with Platonic thought, there is also, and perhaps earlier with Pythagoreanism, there is also an idea within Greek society of reincarnation. Now, some have interpreted, in fact, the cult of Demeter as a cult of reincarnation, but this isn't necessarily clear. It should be noted that there is really almost no surviving attestations as to what the cult actually believed, because it was a secret. And in the ancient world, it seems that authors and scholars generally respected those secrets and did not divulge them, except in very mystical ways which are not clearly understood. And so while some of the symbolism around the cult of Demeter might infer reincarnation, it can also be understood in a variety of ways. And so in the original Celtic religion, it was not simply about reincarnation. Reincarnation was part of it, but it was believed that there was a variety of things that could happen to one upon death. Just as in the Norse religion, not everyone went to Valhalla. The final interesting thing I would like to comment on this is that Celtic spirituality really keeps the idea of crossing water in order to access the land of the dead. Now, we see this in a lot of different traditions. For instance, the river Styx that one must cross in Greek religion in order to access the underworld. Of course, there's the famous journeys into the underworld that generally involve crossing water, but it's also used in the reverse. So when spirits will travel into our world. So for instance, in a story of Mongan, when he is charged with uttering falsehood and he needs to prove what he says is true, he knows this because he is the reincarnation of Finn McCool. And his foster son, or Finn McCool's foster son, comes from the land of the dead to prove his point because he was there to witness it, so he can support what he's saying. And, Finn has, or Mongan in this case, has, guaranteed to give his wife over. And so his wife is very sad, but he says, "Don't worry, because I can hear the footsteps of a man coming who's going to help us. And I hear the footsteps on Loch Lena, on the Dee, on the Boyne." So he's naming all of these different lakes and rivers upon which Caolte is walking in order to cross into their world. So water is the medium through which the dead and the living can pass between worlds. And this is also why we see water deposits, right? Why in the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, people made votive offerings into water, because the water was a gateway to the other world. It's in this respect, I believe, that Lugh is associated with the sea. It's in this respect that he banishes Balor and the Faloiri beneath the waves, because the surface of the water is symbolic of the divide between our world and the underworld. And in some tales, the underworld city is not beyond the waves, it's actually under the water. And it can be at the bottom of a lake or the bottom of a sea. And so it's not consistently represented as an island beyond the water. Sometimes it's represented as being under the water. The clearest parallel to this that I can think of is not even with a specific Indo-European religion, but with Etruscan religion. The Etruscans lived beside other Indo-European groups like the Celts, like the Romans, but they were not themselves actually of Indo-European origin. They were inhabitants from the Neolithic period that had evolved in that area and had never been displaced. They came under heavy Indo-European influence, though. But in some of their burial chambers, which have been very well preserved, very many paintings, depictions of their world, depictions of their beliefs. And something that is relatively interesting in relation to the Celts is it seems they believed also that to access the underworld one must cross or enter into the water. Because on many of these burial tombs it depicts people diving into the sea or swimming in the water, and it does seem that it represents the soul's journey of the person who is in the tomb into the underworld. And so the Celtic view of the afterlife is much more complex than simply one dies and is reincarnated. There were various things that could happen to one, and likely the way to access different forms of afterlife depended on one's actions. A big thanks to my Patreon subscribers who help keep the channel going and help me devote so much time to this. Gurv mi lamaget as eishtach agus marigoni shas gohard.